How to Get Good at Art, Part 2. Photographic Cinematic Composition Terms. Aspect ratio is essentially just the width and height of an image as a proportion rather than pixels. So in this example, we have The Sound of Music presented in two different viewing formats. Old-timey televisions were closer to being square. So they were 4:3 is what we call them. It was a little bit wider than it was taller. Modern televisions are much closer to having the width of the image almost double the height. So we call that 16:9. And when we say these numbers, they're arbitrary units. But it's just like if it's 1 in the height direction, it's also the same length in the width direction. So we use this as a shorthand to kind of show this is the frame that your picture is in. Think of, we call things 8:10, but an 8:10 is actually also an aspect ratio. Or you could, if you want to reduce it, you could call it a 5:4. Generally, you use whole numbers when you're expressing an aspect ratio, because that's just simplest for us to think about. And also, it's like reduced down to the lowest common denominator between the two numbers. So if you have an 8:6, you might want to express that as 4:3 instead, because those two proportions are the same. Once again, The Sound of Music, foreground. Objects appear close and large, not necessarily the subject or even in focus. And one of the kind of tricks to determining if something is the foreground is, can you see all of it? For instance, we cannot see her feet. She's so close to the camera. So that would mean that she is in the foreground. She is basically the subject. She's the one that we want to pay attention to. Behind her is this mountains on the hill that she's on. Far away, that would be the background. And then the middle ground, this is sometimes where you'll have a subject. They'll actually be in the middle ground. They won't be in the foreground. The foreground could be out of focus. Middle ground is, it's the largest area. It's between the foreground and the background. In this case, it's the field that she's in. So she's not, if they didn't capture the field, you would think she was just floating in space above the mountains, which would look very strange. So capturing the middle ground, the field of flowers, not only adds interest with a different color in the image, but also grounds her in space. So not all photos or images that we're creating will have all three of these elements, but manipulating them can help create a sense of space. Color. Color is very subjective. However, color can be used to express emotions. For instance, is this a happy image? Is this a very excited image? No. This is melancholy or sad. Those are the things that we'd think of. And a lot of that has to be created with the skillful application of color. Looks like this image has actually been color graded to get this particular effect. It may not have actually photographed it in the camera this way. They may have had to change the city lights and the skyline a bit to imply this mood. Now, what does this represent? Obviously, this is a little bit on the nose, but yeah, this is happiness. You know, the pink, also the expression and the, kind of the extreme difference between the monochromatic sweater she's wearing and her background. It just creates such a pop of color that it's not subtle at all. So we have color being used in a very assertive way to represent, yes, this is happiness. There's no subtlety here, and sometimes you don't have to be subtle. Tone. Ansel Adams was known for generating images that had really good use of tone. And what we mean by this is he is capturing a photo and also developing it in a way where he is manipulating all of the parts of the image, manipulating highlights, for instance. Highlights are wherever you have a light part of the image, like a little bit of the sun peeking out through the clouds, or the light on the clouds on the left-hand side of the image. You can see that because of that highlight, you can see that cloud actually has 3 dimensions. It's not just a flat surface. Midtones are basically the bulk of the image, and that's like it's not getting full light and it's not getting full shadow, and so it's in a mid-tone area. And then obviously shadows are the darkest parts of the image, and it where something is being covered by another thing, there will be some shadow where the light has not fallen on that side of the image. So you can see in the mountains where some of the clouds are so thick that none of the sunlight is getting on them. So that is creating shadows. So all these things together create tone in an image. And this is just in black and white. So you can do amazingly dramatic work without even applying color. The zone system was formulated by Ansel Adams and Fred Archer. And it represents the full range from black to white, represented by zone 0 being pure black and zone X or 10 being pure white. Each is equivalent to 1 stop on the camera. The dynamic range from 1 to 9, Adams considered to represent the darkest and lightest useful densities that you can have on film. Textural range is considered from 2 to 8. This range of zones conveys a sense of texture and the recognition of substance. So these are kind of breaking it down into more than just shadows and highlights and midtones. Especially in midtones, you can use this zone system to kind of see where different types of midtones should be. Midtone doesn't necessarily mean in every image 50% white as being middle gray. And we should just get everyone's skin to that because it's not necessarily so. So very light skin could be 2 stops above that. So things to think about. This is getting a little thick in the weeds, but this is kind of giving you an idea to go from there. Now, when we're photographing people, obviously we have highlights, which are the whitest parts of the image, like the whites of the eye, hopefully the teeth. But also we have these things called specular highlights. And that's where the lens is actually not capturing what is in front of it because white light is being bounced directly back into the center of the lens. And so that's why we have, in addition to the whites of the eyes, we have this little white circle right next to the pupil. And that is basically the camera giving up and saying, I can't represent what's there. I can't even see it. So that's that's a highlight. But if you're doing searching for something to take a white balance off, these specular highlights are things to avoid because since it is going to give you complete white, there's no color information at all in that. So taking a white balance from one of those parts of the image is not so useful. Midtones are basically the general face should be in kind of the midtone range. Shadows, you need to have shadows or create them using probably dodging or sponging to manipulate the color and the tone. If it isn't in the image, you can manipulate it to get it that way. So for instance, the folds of her clothes, to show that it is actually a texture and it has a form, it's a shape, and it's going around her body. So obviously it's going to have shadows in the area where it's not full onto the camera or where the clothes is folded over itself. Contrast is the difference between color and or tones. This can help separate different forms and shapes from one another. Depth of field is that thing you do with different f-stops to get blurry backgrounds. Essentially, a camera sees the world in a very different way than we do. And one of the things that a camera has a limitation on is how much of the image it can keep in focus. Depending on how long the lens is, it has maybe 3 or 4 inches or maybe a foot that it can keep in focus. That little area that it's focused on, that will be sharp and clear. The background will be blurry. And so this is an element of photographic technique that we can exploit to show backgrounds are further away by making them blurry. If they aren't blurry already, we can use techniques in Photoshop to blur them, to give us this element that we're using a more expensive lens than perhaps we have. So if we're just using our phone and we want to make it look cinematic, there are methods that we can do to get that effect. So field of view is essentially, it's the degrees of arc that the camera lens is able to reproduce. And we go from a fisheye lens, which is basically it can see everything to the left and right, all the way to a 400 millimeter, which is focusing on like about 6 degrees of arc from what the lens is in front of. And here's how to kind of demonstrate field of view, famous scene from Jaws. And that, my friends, is the dolly zoom. Continuous perspective distortion created by going from a wide angle to a telephoto while pulling the camera back. It's a technique, not one that you want to use every day because it is so disruptive, because it's really, if you use that for every scene in your movie, you would have people experiencing vertigo. So, but for, suspenseful moments or where you're wanting to show a mental change, this is very effective. And you can actually do this with drones now. So drones are, you don't have to set up a dolly and have a zoom on your camera. Some of the drones actually have this built into the software that you can achieve this effect. Anyway,